the daily global energy update with what happens next. 1st April 2026. Welcome back. We are now 2 full months into the Middle East crisis, and the IEA is calling this is the single largest supply disruption in recorded history. Up to 20% of the world's oil and energy that normally flows through the Strait of Hormuz choked off, gone. But if you opened your trading app this morning, you might have felt something strange, almost like a relief, because oil actually fell today. Brent tipped below $103. So what is going on? Simple answer. The market is pricing in whispers. Whispers of de-escalation. Whispers of deal being brokered behind closed doors before the April 6th US deadline. But whispers are not barrels. And today we are going to cut through the noise, hard data, why natural gas is in genuine chaos, why the energy trilemma means you will feel this at the pump and at your power bill for months, possibly years, and why the geopolitical map is being redrawn right now as we speak. Look at the board right now. Oil is down roughly 2% in 24 hours. Don't let that fool you for a second. We are still sitting nearly 30% above where we were a month ago. Think about that. 30%. In 4 weeks, here is the ground truth. The Strait of Hormuz is 95% blocked. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq, the Gulf's 3 pillars shed somewhere between 8 to 10 million barrels per day of output through March. For a context, global daily consumption runs around 100 million barrels. So we lost close to 10% of the world supply in a single month. So how is the world not in full meltdown? 2 reasons. And they are both temporary. 1, the United States came into the crisis surprisingly well stocked. 10 million barrel built in a crude inventories provided an early buffer. 2, the IEA pulled the emergency cord and triggered the single largest strategic petroleum reserve release in history. 400 million barrels deployed globally to keep the lights on. This is a massive band-aid, but it is still a band-aid. 400 million barrels released, largest SPR action in IEA history, by the time doesn't solve the problem. LNG in chaos and comfortable coal comeback. So while oil has been dominating the headlines, the real slow motion catastrophe is happening in the gas and LNG markets, and it is not getting nearly enough coverage. Qatar, the second largest LNG exporter on earth, has halted major operations, as we all know, following regional strikes. 17% of its export capacity is completely damaged. Repair estimates run 3 to 5 years. As we all know, force majeure has been declared. That means the contracts are void. The deliveries simply do not happen, and buyers are on their own. The knock-on effect is extraordinary, if you say so. Asian LNG demand is not falling because the region doesn't need power. It is falling because the buyers physically cannot afford the price. At roughly $20 per million metric ton British thermal unit, I say, and the Japan-Korean marker benchmark is inflicting what economists call demand destruction. Pain so severe that markets are stopped functioning normally, and so almost overnight the world is pivoting back to coal. India recorded its first increase in coal procurement in 6 months. Across Europe, Grid operators are burning more coal just to hold that frequency. This is not a choice. It is a survival arithmetic, I say so. The green transition is not dead, but it is on complete hold. Renewables cannot fill an 8 million barrel a day hole overnight. Coal is the emergency bridge that brings us to the single most important concept of understanding everything that is happening right now. I would like to take your attention to, again, Energy Trilemma. All three corners under fire right now: security, affordability, sustainability, all three. This crisis has fractured all three at once. This triangle has been fractured, and this is what makes it historically unique. If I speak about security, the choke point catastrophe, the Hormuz closure has exposed what energy strategist has been warned about for decades. The world's fossil fuel plumbing runs through a handful of narrow geographic choke points. Close one and the entire system backs up. There are no strategic LNG reserves anywhere in the world compared to what the SPRs provides for oil. That LNG gap is now painfully, expensively visible. Affordability, if I speak about, the price that touches everything. US pump prices are sitting above $4 a gallon diesel, which powers every truck, every farm, every building site in America, is up 32% month over month. The European Union is issuing its own warning. Prices will stay elevated even if ceasefire is signed tomorrow. The inflationary pressure is already baked in. Households will be paying for this long after the gun fell silent. Sustainability, the painful pause, the green transition has been put up on hold. Not cancelled, put up on hold. Coal and diesel are being pressed back into services, not out of ideology, I say so, but out of a raw necessity. When you are facing an 8 million barrel a day deficit, wind turbines and solar panels cannot be installed fast enough to fill it. The short term is fossil fuel. The long term, if governments stay the course, remains renewable. But this crisis will cost years of progress to mankind. On the White House side, if I say so, a deep internal divide seems to be appearing. One faction argues for handling contract of the Strait to Iran to exit the war fast. The other wants to fight it through. The decision made in Washington over the next 72 hours will move the oil price by $10 to $15 in either direction. Geopolitics, if I may speak about right now, there are three moves that are rewriting the map. That data tells the story if you look into. Geopolitical moves happening beneath that data, those are arguing to define the energy order for the next decade. Let me walk you through all three of them. First, India buys Iranian oil for the first time in 7 years. In last 7 years, India has just imported crude oil from Iran for the first time since 2019, exactly 7 years. The price, roughly around $100 a barrel. Let that number sink into you. A barrel of oil from a heavily sanctioned, politically isolated source now commanding $100 a barrel. That tells you everything about how starved this market is. Back in 2019, Trump administration eliminated the significant reduction exceptions, the waivers that had allowed India and handful of others to keep buying Iranian crude without triggering US sanctions. India shut off the tap immediately to protect its dollar-based trade relationships. So what changed? Either Washington quietly issued a new carve-out to inject more supply into the bleeding market, or New Delhi has simply decided that energy security now outweighs the risk of US financial friction. Both interpretations signal a massive shift. India is no longer waiting for Western permissions to secure its energy needs. That is the structural change seen in recent years in how the world's most populous democracy manages its foreign policy. And in the global energy crisis impact is already landing at the Indian household level, as well as commercial LPG prices rose somewhere around 17% in a single day. Domestic cylinder prices climbed 6%. Aviation turbine fuel, the jet fuel that powers every flight out of Bombay, Delhi, Bangalore, crossed 200 rupees per liter for the first time in Indian history. What does that mean on the ground? Eating out gets more expensive. Restaurant gas bills through menus. Fuel and transportation cost eat into projects' margin. Air travel, already recovering from the pandemic years, is now facing a new affordability wall. So India's strategic petroleum reserves, if I speak about, enough for roughly 1 to 1.5 months of consumption, are now under serious stress. And analysts are already marking their calendar. We have to watch April seriously. The full impact of March prices hikes has not yet passed through the entire supply chain. So there is more pain coming. And Iran, if Iran-backed groups are now start threatening the blockade to the Red Sea, I say, so if that route closes, shipping distance from Europe to India jumps from approximately 22,000 kilometers now to somewhere around 35,000 kilometers, forcing vessels to circumnavigate the entire continent of Africa. That is not a logistic inconvenience. It's a supply chain earthquake. The second reason, if I speak about, is Asia pivots hard to Russian crude. Here is the second seismic move. Asia, and particularly the region's major refiners, are pivoting aggressively towards Russian crude, following the adjustment of US sanctions waiver that shifted economics of purchasing Russian supply. Since 2002, if I speak about, Russian oil has been operating under Western sanctions and Western pricing caps, insurance bans, financial restrictions. So to survive, Russia reoriented its entire export machine eastward, offering deep discounts to willing buyers in Asia. Now, with the Gulf supply effectively gone and Qatar LNG crippled, those discounts look even more attractive. What this cements is something the energy world has been watching for 3 years. The Asian energy grid is no longer a swing market, moving between Russia and Gulf supply based on price. It's becoming a structurally dependent on Russian barrels. That is the realignment, if I say so. This realignment, with the consequences that will be outlasting the crisis by decades, because this West structural risk, if Asia unlocks into Russian supply chain now, the West ability to use energy sanctions as a geopolitical lever in future crisis diminishes significantly. So the third aspect, if I speak about, the Europe and China are hoarding, and that tells you everything. The third move is in some ways most revealing and the most alarming, I feel so. The European Union and China both aggressively buying crude oil, not to consume it, but to store it, to hoard it. When the world's two largest import blocks move simultaneously into the stockpiling mode, they take floating supply off the market. even as demand stays constant. So the result is an artificial demand shock that pushed price higher. But more importantly, stockpiling, I see that as a signal. It is a government saying we believe things are going to get worse before they get better. Brussels and Beijing both are reading the same intelligence and reaching the same conclusion. Brace market fear indicators, I would say so. Both EU and China appear to be hedging against either a wider conflict, deeper production cuts, or sanctions escalation. None of those scenarios are going to be good for the world. Daily energy facilities are getting hit. Drone strike on Castrol facility in Erbil, Kurdistan. While we were compiling this update for you, news broke off that there is a drone strike on an oil storage facility belonging to British company Castrol in Erbil, in Kurdistan region of northern Iraq. The footage I saw was devastating. What I understood is this attack used what military analysts are calling a double tap tactic. So first drone strike identifies a weakness and causes an initial small damage. The smoke plumps becomes a targeting coordinate. The second strike hits the exact same spot, maximizing destruction and making the fire almost impossible to extinguish. That is not luck again. That is precision. What this tells us is that Iranian drone capabilities have evolved dramatically. These are no longer cheap swarm drones launched and hoped for. These are intelligent adaptive systems executing multi-phase targeting sequence. The question this raises for me as an energy observant, and I want to hear from you in the comments, whether Middle East completely or Middle East region infrastructure is genuinely prepared for this level of tactical precision strikes, because the evidence today suggests the answer for me is simply no. They are not prepared. And I just saw some human toll. I just went through country by country global possibilities. So I noticed there is a possibility that you will see fuel queues around, school closures, empty pumps. It is appearing as an energy slowdown, not a lockdown. But the true measure of any global shock was never found in a Brent charter or an IEA press release. It might get written in the silence of shuttered of classroom closed. When the Strait of Hormuz fell silent in early March 2026, the world did not break even completely. It fractured along the old fault line in economic history. Who has the oil and who doesn't? Let us walk through those fault lines together, country by country, and feel what largest supply disruptions in history has actually done to real people in real time. So some nations I've categorized as in critical. The nations running out start, say for example, Bangladesh, a nation of 175 million souls that imports 95% of its energy, and watched the pumps run dry almost overnight. Rationing became a law. Universities closed their gates. Schools shifted online, not for convenience this time, but to conserve every precious kilowatt. Young dreams of graduates escaping from poverty were suspended while families stood in blistering heat, hoping today might be finally the day the tanker arrived. Across the border in Pakistan, if I say so, deeply tied to Gulf supply. Pakistan is deeply tied. The pain can just as deep. Schools shut for more than 2 weeks now. The government ordered a 4-day working week, sent half of the civil service home, imposed sweeping austerity on the state that was only just beginning to breathe again. Children lost classrooms, workers lost wages. If I speak about Sri Lanka, still bearing the psychological scars of its last energy nightmare, slipped back into survival mode. The National Fuel Pass in Sri Lanka returned. A QR code weekly cap on how much petrol or diesel each vehicle could purchase. Public institutions took mandatory Wednesday off to slash demand. The island that once taught the world resilience now taught it how to stretch a single tank of petrol across 7 anxious days. And in Africa, if I speak about in Zimbabwe, the desperation was raw. Prices rocketed nearly 40%. The government raced to raise ethanol blending from 5 to 20% and scrapped several taxes. Anything to make the little fuel remaining stretch a few more miles for farmers, mothers, and small businesses. Those were fighting to keep their doors open. And some countries faced record highs where prices shattered historical ceilings. Some nations didn't just feel the squeeze, they broke records that we'll see in their energy pricing history books. For generations, Cambodia endured the single largest fuel price hike anywhere on earth, 68%. Vietnam followed with a 55% surge, somewhere around 50 to 55%. So sudden that a panic buying emptied stations within hours, leaving markets silent and families stranded. Nigeria absorbed a 35% rise, with some diesel reports suggesting that actually numbers were even worse. Laos took a 33% blow. These weren't abstract percentages. These were the choices made by these governments. Feed the children or fill the tank. Keep the shop open or close it forever. And Americas, even the wealthiest hemisphere, bled in the United States. Diesel surged between 37 and 45%, climbing to roughly $5 to $5.45 a gallon nationally. Regular gasoline jumped 27 to 36%, hovering near $4 nationally. In California, I spoke to some of my friends. Some pumps crossed $5.29. Ordinary Americans who had planned road trips, commutes, and weekend family drives faced a bill that felt like a new tax on everyday life. Let's look into Canada. Canada absorbed 28% rise. Brazil rushed emergency fuel tax cuts through parliament. Mexico reached for government-capped prices. From the Rio Grande to the Amazon, governments scrambling to shield their citizens from fire they had not lit. Europe, the continent that preached energy independence, confronts its limits. Across Europe, if I say so, diesel climbed about €2. €2 a liter in Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Finland. Ireland saw worst in EU, €2.30. Spain recorded the bloc's largest single jump, 27%. And Britain watched diesel rising 13%, with inflation forecasts being revised above 5%. Governments reached for every tool available. Austria and Portugal slashed fuel taxes. Hungary capped prices outright. France began releasing strategic reserves. Yet, in Germany and Italy, recession warnings grew louder. Industrial energy surge of 30% began appearing in factory invoices. Truckers idled. Families tightened belts. The Europe that had spent years building toward energy independence, now confronted with the brutal truth. It was not there yet. Asia managed, for now I say so. A handful of Asian giants managed to hold the line, barely I say so. Japan, 95% dependent on Gulf oil, cracked open the emergency reserves. South Korea, 70% reliant on same lifeline, imposed price caps for the first time in 30 years. China capped domestic price increase at 11% and banned fuel export to protect its own population. India, 85% Gulf dependent, pulled off something remarkable, a rabbit from the hat, pulled off something very remarkable. Pump prices rose only about 5% for now, held down by heavy subsidies and tax relief. But analysts are already marking April in red. Thailand kept its caps in place. Philippines, feeling the strain most acutely, declared a full national emergency on energy front on March 24th. Even prosperous Singapore and Taiwan watched Qatari LNG supplies disappear or get rerouted, forcing a fundamental rethink every watt of power they consume. Fragile, that is the word that echoes across the region managed today. But one more week of closed straits could turn management into meltdown. If I say so, the producers, and then there were the exceptions, the producers like Saudi Arabia, Russia, UAE, as net exporters, they sit largely insulated. Their pumps are still flowing. Their economies are still humming. History will note the bitter irony. The very geography that helped trigger this crisis is the same geography least touched by its flames. This is not a story of numbers anymore. It is a story of a child missing a school in Dhaka because of the power grid cannot hold. A farmer idling his tractor in Harare, Zimbabwe because the diesel cost more than the crop is worth. A commuter in Berlin quietly wondering whether tomorrow's tank will be the last affordable one. While 10 million barrels a day vanish from the market, the world does not adjust smoothly. It fractures, and as April dawns, the question every leader, every parent, every ordinary citizen like you and me is asking is the same. How much longer can we hold? So I've drafted some possibilities for your reference. 1 to 4 week outlook. So where does this go from here? Let me give you 3 possible scenarios. The base case, the upside, the risk, and the downside risk. So base case, price stays volatile but range bound around $100. The massive SPR release cushions the market. Volatility is high, but a catastrophic failure is avoided. This holds as long as the Hormuz blockade does not deepen. Upside risk. If the Hormuz closure drags on for another 2 to 4 million barrels per day is lost, expect a price reset of somewhere around $110 plus per barrel and a new wave of demand destructions globally. Downside risk. If the April 6th, which is a US deadline, it produces a rapid ceasefire and shipping restarts, even partially, we could see a $10 to $15 drop in Brent within 48 hours. Now we have to watch Washington. April 6th is the date to watch. Whatever happens in the next 72 hours will be the most market-moving geopolitical event in the energy world since 2022. The bottom line, and I want to hear this clearly, we are watching the forced real-time rewriting of global energy security. The assumption that the Middle East would always reliably, flawlessly deliver fossil fuels to the world and depending on them is not quite possible now. That assumption is gone. It does not come back in the short term. Expect governments everywhere to aggressively subsidize fossil fuels to keep their population stable in the medium term. Watch for a radical, I would say radical rethinking of supply chains, reserve strategies, and pipeline diplomacy in the long term. And this is my conviction. This crisis will do more to accelerate the energy transition that a decade of climate summits have never done that before, because nothing focuses the mind like a pain. What do you think happens on April 6th? Is there a deal, or does this escalate further with boots on ground? I genuinely want to know. Drop your take in the comments below. If this breakdown was useful, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already done. We post daily updates on exactly this kind of story. And if you know someone who needs to understand energy markets, what is happening right now, share this with them. I will see you in the next one. And I hope there is no energy lockdown like COVID lockdown. Of course, we are in a phase of energy slowdown. See you soon. Thank you very much. I am Jeetu.